the Countryside Podcasts with Chris Skinner. Back again at High Ash Farm, and it's another Countryside Podcast with farmer Chris Skinner. Here we are at High Ash Farm. Hello, Chris.
Matthew, you keep bringing the rain with you every week.
Yeah, it's just before dusk and very grey skies, and there's some very threatening looking clouds.
Yes, I think we'll be all right, but it's actually perfect weather for what we're now going to look at. And I hope you've got a head for heights, because there's a tractor waiting for us with a cherry picker on the front.
Oh, yes, I wondered what this was here for.
That is for us, believe it or not.
So we're going to get in the...
We're going to get in a cherry picker. We're going to go up about 7 metres probably and start today's podcast off with an interesting species that really comes into flower only at this time of the year. So hop in.
Bright yellow platform here, which is on the end of a JCB. Bang my head already. Yep. JCB. I think you've got Neil in there to do the honours.
Yes, Neil's going to lift us up. There goes the safety catch. And
thumbs up.
Here we go, thumbs up. Yes, so this is a health and safety approved cherry picker. And,
oh my God.
And
wow, oh, different perspective.
Yes.
We're level with the roof of your workshop now.
That's right, yes. Here we go, a little bit closer. I can just do this.
Chris just directing the traffic.
And there we are. And I'll just pick my torch up there, which is beside you.
Yep. Here it is.
Perfect. The reason I've brought you up here is because it's the kind of wettest time of the year. You arriving today has proved that. And with some species which we're going to look at on this week's podcast, which really only come to their height of their year at this time of the year. At the end of winter, more or less the beginning of spring, and this is the time of the year that they fruit. So, an important time of the year for tonight's subject, which is Tortula muralis, which is a fungus. And no, it's not a fungus as such, it's one of the many species of moss, I should say. And if I turn a light on and shine it just across the top of it, you can see all these little hair-like protrusions coming out.
And this is like a corrugated roof here,
yes,
isn't it?
It's the old post-war concrete asbestos roof. So it's all been registered and it's all official, and eventually, like all the other buildings on the farm, the roofs get replaced completely because it's a health and safety issue. But this was widely used at the end of the Second World War. But because of the sort of texture of the asbestos there, if I just tap it, it's slightly porous and it holds water. And it's also really alkaline as well. The cement portion in the asbestos contains a lot of lime, so it's an ideal medium for mosses and lichens to grow on. And look, it's just coming into what we would call a flower, but it's actually registered as a non-flowering plant. I've got some huge volumes of books that I look at occasionally in the evening, and one would be Flora Britannica, and there's not a mention of a moss in it because it doesn't come into flower as we would know it. But what it does at this time of the year is produce these tiny little spore capsules, and it's really attractive. When we have a close look, you can see the moss down there, which is lovely green. It's got little silver hairs on the top of it, and then during late January and during February, these little spore capsules, and I shine it up across the roof, you can see there's thousands of them.
Yes, and they're sticking up quite proud there,
yes,
aren't they?
And what happens is they will dry in the next week or so, and then the little caps come off, and it's like a twisted series of hairs inside those tiny little spore capsules. And inside the hairs are all the spores. And so the hairs unfold. It's rather like sort of putting your hair into a pigtail, or in my hair in any case, and then unwinding it, and the dust or the spores then comes out, and that's how they reproduce themselves. And there's some younger ones at the top. They're absolutely beautiful green. You can see what we're talking about are really fashionable colours.
Yes, the different shades of green, aren't they?
Yes.
It's really quite beautiful, isn't it?
It is, yes, and it's often, why I brought you up here while we're in a cherry picker is because generally you don't see it, you just walk past and ignore it, and yet it's really important out in the environment. I suppose mosses and lichens, we'll talk about lichens in a minute, are sort of the ancestors of the earliest plants that inhabited our planet, right back, millennia ago. And they're important because they hold a lot of moisture. You can see the water's actually dripping out under the corrugations, and that's why it's important, because mosses dry out. Why it's an interesting plant is, in May, June and July, you could almost fry an egg on this roof. It is so hot.
This is a hostile environment up here,
Yes.
all year really, but
All the
particularly
year.
with heat and cold.
Exactly, and this species, the Tortula species, muralis, actually copes with it really well. So that's why it gets on now while there's adequate moisture about, and goes through its life cycle quite quickly, actually, in sort of from about a 3-week period, and then these little clumps of moss can actually dry off on this roof. It gets baked. They all gets washed off into the gutter here. So if I look down in the gutter, there's some already there, all soaked through, and then the blackbirds come along because it's full of insects and moths and lay their eggs in it. And the blackbirds flick all the moss out onto the farmyard way below us.
It is amazing how it establishes itself just
Yes.
in the most difficult areas, like this plastic.
Exactly, it's a plastic gutter, and so that's why I'm hugely respectful of it. And it's just one of those foundation species that is so important to us, and everything else kind of developed. So it doesn't have leaves. That's the first thing to note about it. It has little spiral twisted bits, and it just is, each one is totally dependent. It doesn't have roots either. You can see I've removed a little bit of the moss clump here, and there's no roots into the asbestos. It has something called rhizoids, which are tiny little fibre-like hairs. It attaches itself to substrates like this asbestos roof, but not in the form of a root as we would know it. So it's no leaves, no roots, and yet it can withstand this hugely hostile environment. Oh, there's a lovely clump there. Look, talk about being a weird farmer. I get quite excited about seeing moss coming into flower like that.
That's spreading from one corrugation
Yes,
to the
it
other,
does,
isn't
and
it?
it'll go right over the roof here. So it's huge. There's a lot of weight up here, actually, but it's really important. And out in the woodland, we might, if it's not pitch dark, we might go and venture some of the other species that grow down on the woodland floor. And the deer here at the farm are venturing into the woods, and they're kind of grazing on it, so quite amazing. It's got a really wide reputation for insects and all sorts of invertebrates as well.
But in the heat of summer, this can have, as you say, many, many degrees of heat blaring down on it from the sun, and yet it bakes solid, but it survives.
It does, because it kind of can go into I was going to say almost hibernation, but obviously that's not the right word. It's a kind of sort of death almost. But then when rain comes back in again, and some of the clumps, many of them are quite fresh clumps, because many of them just get washed off. If you get a heavy summer storm, they'll wash off into the gutter. But some stay here year after year, and they're the bright green ones here that are all fresh and just beginning to send out their spores. And so it's so resilient, and that's the amazing thing about it. It's had to come through ice ages. You'll find it on mountains, quite near the top of mountains, in the most hostile conditions, and there are dozens and dozens of different species, each kind of specialising in a different habitat. This one just happens to be on a kind of rock substitute, which is the asbestos roof here.
And it's got incredible properties as well. It purifies.
Absolutely, and so that's why it's so important, because one particular moss species is found on peat bogs. It's sphagnum moss, and it can be meters and meters deep, so you kind of can drill through it and you get a profile through the peat, which is all this sphagnum moss, and it will tell you what was there almost millennia ago, because you can get a profile, you can find out what pollen was about. So as our island retreated from the last ice age, or rather the ice retreated, I should say, then the early colonisers were the mosses and the lichens. So they've kind of kept a fossil record of the transition from plants that don't have leaves or roots, this moss, to our wonderful trees. And our island, we think, eventually was covered completely in oak trees, and just an amazing transition. Anyway, I think it's going home time for Neil. So
I think he's gone home already. We're going to be
Well,
left 20 feet in the air.
in which case, we're sort of walking on sunshine in the morning, if that's the case.
Of course,
Right.
he hasn't deserted his post,
Right.
so we're
I'll
signalling
give
him.
the thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
And
We're going to be
hopefully-
lowered to ground level.
Hopefully it's a descent. So this is a new one for you, Matthew. Sort of 20 feet up in the air. And here we go, retreating back towards the tractor. And now we start the descent now. It's like a fairground attraction, isn't it, at High Ash? But nevertheless, we would never have seen that without going up on a ladder. And of course, it's a bit dangerous to do that.
From the ground, you just can't see it. Sloshing through some puddles here. It really has been quite wet at times today, and we're still on the farmyard here with one of your oldest, if not the oldest, outbuildings here on the farm.
Yes, this predates the asbestos roof we were just looking at by about 200 years. We hadn't thought about asbestos then, and these are good old Norfolk clay pantiles. And it's quite a famous building, really, because it's been used for lots of different things here at the farm. Formerly, in my childhood, as a dairy milking parlour, 6-a-side cows being milked simultaneously, and we're standing on the holding yard, which is concrete, and that's where the bulk milk tank was in years ago. There goes the tractor, now going to bed. Neil can go home now. And why I've brought you here is, I said it's quite famous because anybody with Birds Britannica, one of the famous books that covers all the UK birds, I think it's written by Mark Cocker and Richard Maybe, they're the joint authors, they wanted to record sparrows at High Ash Farm and get some really good footage. So to do the same thing as we just did, an RSPB photographer came out called Chris Gomershall, and I lifted him up over this roof, and we got a fantastic cock house sparrow coming in with a feather in its beak to go under the ridge tiles, which I've all made into sparrow nest boxes. And what the photograph shows, and it's in the sparrow section of Birds Britannica, is a cock sparrow going underneath that roof tile. A fantastic picture, but I didn't really see the beauty of the sparrow. But what I did see, and I brought the tile to show you, is Xanthoria parietina, which is a lichen growing all over the roof. And Chris Gomershall accidentally photographed this tile, and it's in the middle of that huge tome of a book that I use as a reference book.
And so we've looked at moss. Now this is lichen.
Yes.
Is there is obviously it looks different, but is there a different way it works?
Yes. Very slow growing. Again, it grows in the most inhospitable sort of conditions. This is south facing clay tiles, and it will coat gravestones in churchyards, mountainsides. Again, there are dozens and dozens of lichen species. The wetter the better, but again this particular one is called Xanthoria parietina, Unfortunately, all these mosses, they don't really have common names. So it's spelt with an X, would you believe, to start it off, Xanthoria parietina. But it's a combination. So what we're looking at is two plants growing together, a fungus and an algae. And they've joined together to form a lichen.
And it's a mustard colour, isn't it, with greenish bits here on this foot-long pantile.
Right, I've got torch with me, and I'm going to light it up. And suddenly, you see the most beautiful sort of ochre yellows and greens, and the green bit around the edge of that is growing out over the pantile, and it will come in and produce spores again in a week or two's time before the heat comes. And again, on that south-facing roof tile, you can almost you can't bear your hand on it on a July day, and yet this species survives it and kind of thrives. So we're looking at really amazing plants.
These are as hard as nails, aren't they?
Yeah, like me, of course. but they've been here hundreds of years, and this will perhaps grow a millimetre or so a year. And I've got my local photographer to take a photograph of this with her macro lens, so you'll see it on the High Ash Farm Facebook page this weekend.
It looks like an oil colour painter has got his palette.
Oh, exactly that. But the colours are the height of fashion at the moment, would you believe? These lichen colours, right through Scottish tweeds, started it off with the heather colours and the colours of the mountains and moors, and now it's graduated through into the palettes that you might put in your bedroom or wear, top fashion designs as well. They're really beautiful. Just listen, I'm listening as while I'm talking, because just behind us, it's evensong for that robin.
That's the robin we heard last week.
Yes, it's doing a dawn chorus and an evening chorus as well. How beautiful is that? There we are, but do enjoy the moss that we've looked at. Tortula muralis, and this lichen, which is Xanthoria parietina. Both amazing plants.
Enjoying hearing the robin, but another very audible bird at this time of year is a bird that Chris has gone in search of early one morning.
Exactly that.
The ducks at High Ash Farm going in to roost for an evening. Hey everyone, it's Matthew here, and if you've been enjoying our countryside podcasts, we've got a small favour to ask.
Yes, Matthew. What we're going to do is to ask for a small donation to help run the podcast, and any surplus goes for conservation at High Ash Farm here. And so it's really important. We both love to keep the podcast going, and that duck agrees with me, I think.
Well, it's straightforward to donate. You can make a one-off donation or set up a small monthly contribution, and the address is highashfarm.com/podcast.
We're hugely grateful for any support. It means we can keep sharing the stories of the countryside, which I love doing each week, but it's that small amount of cost we need to cover. So thank you very much in advance. Good morning, everybody. The sun's just peeping up above the horizon. We've had a lot of rain overnight, and it's cleared now. Clear blue sky above me, and I'm standing in Cantley Hill plantation. That's 12 acres of venerable old beech trees, a few Scots pines scattered in, and last week we celebrated the robin doing a dawn chorus, and I thought for this week's programme I'd stay with the thrush species and record, and it's singing quite close to me, about 40 yards away, one of the largest resident thrushes. That's a Mistle Thrush. My grandfather, who was born in the neighbouring county of Suffolk, called this bird Jenny Joy. And it wasn't years later that I discovered it's a derivation of January Joy, although we're in February this morning. And my father called it yet another name. He called it a stormcock, because although the wind is blowing a bit through the top of the trees, you can just hear the birds singing right above my head. It will sing particularly at this time of the year, late January, February into March. Come rain or shine or wind, particularly if it's windy, it would carry on singing. It's not as competent as a songster, I must say, because we've got several pairs here at the farm, as the song thrush. The song thrush is Turdus philomenos, and this particular species, the mistle thrush, is called Turdus vociferus. All the same family as the nightingale, blackbird, redwing and fieldfare, and all of them sing in some sort or another. But the mistle thrush amuses me because right outside the farmhouse where I was born is a huge, and I mean a huge, yew tree. It's 70 feet tall, 65 feet, 70 feet, about 3 feet through the trunk, and in autumn it gets covered in red arils. They're the kind of yew berries, if you like, bright red, and some jackdaws just trying to get in a nest hole not far from me. Can still hear the mistle thrush singing away regardless of me getting closer to the tree it's in. And a mistle thrush would sometimes take over that yew tree, and if I had a cat at the time, if the cat went too close to the tree, the mistle thrush sounded like some sort of those old-fashioned wooden football rattles, and it'd make this horrendous noise. But at this time of the year it kind of compensates, and once it's set up a territory, it sings in it with this more jangled, less sort of proficient song, I suppose. The song thrush will often repeat notes 2 or 3 times over. Both the birds look quite similar, really. Mistle thrush is a touch bigger, about 10.5 inches from tip of beak to tail, 2 white outer tail feathers when it flies off, and quite white underneath the wings if it flies overhead, and covered in those very bold brown speckles, very erect, and often seen out in parks, and particularly here at the farm on the pastures. And the song thrush much more in gardens. They're the ones that lay the bright blue eggs. That's a song thrush, mud-lined nest, a little bit smaller, warmer colour brown on the back than the mistle thrush, which is kind of greyish and grey brownish sepia on the back, whereas the song thrush has a creamy coloured breast with less pronounced spots, I suppose. But if it flies overhead, you could slightly mistake it for a redwing, because underneath the wings when it flies over it's kind of almost yellowy orange, so you could be mistaking it for a redwing, but that's much more russety red when they fly overhead. All members of the same family though, but the mistle thrush is resident, and how it got its name mistle thrush, it's dropped part of the name out of its common name. The mistle thrush was called a mistletoe thrush because that's one of its favourite foods, particularly down in the southern half of the UK. Once you move further north, then it's more dependent on hawthorn berries or haws, and also on rowan berries as well, which are its favourite food. So less mobile, so it's much more of an agricultural bird, I suppose, but it chooses these tall trees that are all around me, and it will sing in the same tree when it does start singing, more or less every morning, so it's quite reliable. And you can hear the song. It's as I said, it's more broken up than song thrush. Song thrush practices notes 2 or 3 times over, almost as though it's kind of polishing its song and refining it, and hence Turdus philomenos, the sort of songbird, really, of songbirds, if you can understand that. But special thing about mistle thrushes is they nest really early, and really unusually out in the fork of a tree. You'd think they'd be quite vulnerable to birds like magpies predating the nest, but I said that the females, when she's on the nest, are absolutely ferocious, and if a male mistle thrush gets alarmed, it will make this horrendous rattle sound, an alarm call, and it will also attack predators by dive bombing them. And I've seen mistle thrushes, actually a pair of them, one came off the nest and they both had a go at a magpie, and the magpie had to retreat. It was quite funny. So really, really interesting birds, only because they sing particularly well at this time of the year, if you can call their song particularly well. But nevertheless, it's got that lovely, if you listen, it's that kind of musical note that thrushes have. Same with the robin. Robin's far more high-pitched. And we've got one singing in the farmyard every morning, but I had to come out into the woodland here, and the mistle thrush sort of forms loose flocks at the end of the breeding season. Sometimes I can see groups of 12 or even 20 here at the farm, and they'll all fly up into trees. They're much less approachable than the song thrush, so once I'm out and about, they tend to get out of the way, fly up into the trees, and then come back down on the field to eat their main diet, which is worms and soil invertebrates. Whereas with your song thrush, they'll also eat worms and snails, particularly snails, and song thrushes will use a stone in a corner of your garden or in some parkland and smash the snail shells, and if they have a special stone like that, we call it an anvil, but that's the song thrush. But many people do get confused between the two species, but nevertheless we're being serenaded, and I hope you are too, by that rather jangly song of the mistle thrush. And I can now see it sit right at the top of the tree, although the song sounds quite a distance away. It's only 30 yards, 40 yards from me, so I'll let the thrush finish.
Just coasting down one of the farm tracks. The windows are open, and so we can smell the air, and movements down towards the bottom there.
Yes, Matthew, we're on a really ancient track that joined Arminghall and Case to St Edmund. It's called Greensides Loke. I think the gamekeeper in the post-war years was a Mr. Jack Greensides, and somehow or other this loke has been named after him. Well, it's better than Skinner's Loke, let's put it like that. And it's lovely. It's got a lot of history. The hedge on our right is on the earliest High Ash Farm map, which is in the 1600s, and the one on the left is planted in 2006 under government HLS stewardship. But that's not where I'm looking, because on our left, if I just move forwards a little bit more, I hope they're still there. Yes, I can see movement in the trees. Excellent.
So we're looking high up?
Yes, in the newly planted trees, which are all about 20, 25 feet tall, on our left, there's a communal roost of one of the crow species, but not one that we've covered before. It's a bit of a villain of the countryside. It's the magpie, pica pica, the scientific name. And I suppose it's one of the most heavily persecuted birds still in the UK. They're trapped. Formerly they were poisoned till the poisons that were being used on them were banned. And you'd have special traps which are still legal, which capture live magpies. You first of all capture one and put it in one half of a trap, and then the other half of the trap's got a spring-loaded door on the top of it, and it's called a Larsen trap. So another magpie, if it sees one in its territory, they're extremely territorial and quite aggressive, will come and investigate the one that's there and accidentally drop on the trap door and go into, and that's the one that gets dispatched. So it's a bit brutal, but it is legal still. And a local game shooting estate just on the west side of Norwich last year caught over 1,000 magpies. It's not far from Norwich, and the reason is magpies have changed their habits a little bit. In the 1970s, you barely ever saw them in an urban setting. hardly, if ever, in towns and cities, even in the centre of London, they were completely absent. And they've got used to our bad habits of throwing food on the floor, so they can kind of make a living from what we throw away. But they're ruthless egg hunters, and everybody gets very frustrated because they will take young songbirds from the nest. It's really just a summertime feast for them, if you like, but it's really easy to get angry. They will also take birds that nest on the ground, their eggs, so anything that's vulnerable. And when you have a good hedge like this, magpies will search along the hedge. They're very sort of sharp-eyed members of the crow family. It's almost one of the most widespread birds in the world, second only to the raven, which is another member of the crow family.
And fiercely intelligent as well. You mentioned that, but they also nick people's shiny objects and washing off the line.
They are. Jackdaws will do the same thing, but magpies particularly are, well, I suppose if you break the name down, it's kind of maggot pie. So one place you're likely to see them in our modern world is feasting on the carrion that gets killed on the roads overnight, and they'll fly up at the last minute. Really distinctive birds, though. Got a long black beak. Oh, some jackdaws just coming into the same portion of wood to roost. If I just let the car freewheel down the hill a little bit more, we'll get a little bit closer. I can see silhouettes of some. There's perhaps 20 or 30. It's quite surprising. Just in the back trees there, as we cruise down the hill, some of them might still take flight. It's not quite fully dark yet, but I can see the silhouette. Yes, I can see them. We're now going to come level with us. We're just freewheeling down the hill.
So this is where they roost.
There's what we call a communal roost, and they'll all get together at this time of the year. So it's quite a strong roost, meaning there's quite a large number. And people will say, well, why aren't you controlling them? Why aren't you shooting them and get rid of them? Because I'm interested in songbirds, but I've learnt to stand back. And in so doing, I've learnt something important, that magpies are incredibly territorial. They don't like others on their patch. So once you have what we call a dominant pair of magpies in an area, they will attack the others and see them off, because they're going to look after that patch. There goes one, just come in to roost. It just flew. Two more just come in as well. It's not an attractive sound, not like a songbird. It sounds, the best way to describe it is like a machine gun going off. It's really loud and repetitive, and some flying round. That's a jackdaw going over the top. But the magpies are coming in now, quite close to us. So what I've decided to do is to leave them, and they set up their territories. And if a large area of farm like this, covering about a square mile with the woodland and all the tracks, can't support a pair or two of magpies, that's a poor old job. But interesting, they know their own habits. They, as you said, intelligence may come into it, because if they find dried bread in the garden, they've been known to dip it in water to eat it, to soak it. Also, in some of the urban areas, when people have eggs delivered on their doorstep beside the weekly or daily pointer, magpies learnt that it's like a nest, and they would raid the top of the egg box. So some intelligence there, but as I said, there's a little bit of guilt in their nesting habitats, because they build a nest exactly like crows, sort of a flat top nest made of sticks, but because of their guilt they put a lid on it so other birds can't see their own eggs. That does amuse me. I think jackdaws are coming in.
There's quite a squabble going on.
There's a squabble, and the magpies are coming in all around us as well now.
Let's just listen for a few seconds.
They're sorting out their pairs. They will have already pair bonded, but they seem to carry it on sort of early in February, which we are now, and they'll carry that sort of bonding process. Birds of a feather flock together is the old motto from centuries ago, and it's still true today. And not until they start breeding, in fact, the male and the female will build a nest. And the first layer, where she's going to lay the eggs, is sometimes lined with mud and grasses. 4 or 5 bluish background eggs with brown spots on them. Incubation about 18, 19 days, and then the young, the little black and white birds with very short tails sort of hobble about. They're quite amusing if you see them in the garden, but as adults they're very confident. They kind of strut in a very kind of assertive manner, as though they, it's their domain and they own the place, and other birds kind of get out of their way. So a little bit of history there.
There's also folklore, isn't there?
There certainly is. There's a huge amount of folklore, and some of the sort of phrases and songs and adages come into our language. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, and then it goes on like that, right up to number 12 or 13. Yes, I think 6 is perhaps for a kiss or something like that. I can't remember them all.
Amazing Mr. Magpie.
Exactly that. Beautiful birds, iridescent, all just looks like black and white from a distance when you see the sunlight on the plumage. Amazing. And the little primary wing feathers, half the feather is white and half the feather is black.
Rat has been retrieved. Where was he?
He's halfway down the track. As I walked down to retrieve him, there was a really powerful and pungent smell of what can only be Mr. Fox. So I'm lucky he didn't go and trailblaze after the fox.
I can see him sniffing in the air. He's obviously got something.
Yes, that's his favourite quarry. He won't ever hurt one, but he would like to give chase, and the fun for him is in the chase. But fortunately, I've retrieved him. Wet paws, in fact, wet all over because it's raining quite hard out there now.
Well, as always, we've been delighted to receive your messages. And here's one from the United States. Susan Thomas lives in Nashville, Tennessee. Chris, I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but could the emerald ash borer beetle now have penetrated the UK? The cause of the spread of this beetle is based on human activity. It was first found in Michigan about 20 years ago and has now spread to most states. The way the tree dies sounds similar to what we're dealing with here. I live in Nashville and have visited your farm in the past. I'd hate to think it was one of your fans that inadvertently carried the beetle to your farm.
Oh, fortunately, we don't have the emerald boring beetle here at the moment, but it is in parts of Europe, and it's kind of spreading at a rate of about 30-40 kilometres per year. So I think it's probably only a matter of time. After all, ash dieback of the airborne fungus arrived from the Netherlands about 25 years ago, and it's so widespread and destructive. And of course, as it's high ash farm, I've a very sort of keen interest on the ash trees here at the farm. Nevertheless, it's a beautiful little beetle, about half an inch long, 13 millimetres long, bright emerald green, but the damage it does to the ash trees is unbelievable. Yet another nail in the coffin, possibly, of our most wonderful native trees.
Hello to Shoba, who's emailed the podcast. Chris, I love your show and have followed it through its various guises. Thank you for sharing your joy and passion of wildlife and biodiversity. I don't recall if this has already been done, but even if it has been, it would be great for Matthew to interview you about your life and how you've acquired so much knowledge.
It's all happened by accident, really, Matthew. It's a long answer for that question. Perhaps we will do it on another occasion. But the farm has kind of been like my office window, and I've just been really infected, if that's the right word to use, by all the variety, in fact the biodiversity of the wildlife that's here naturally at the farm. And I've tried to do something that's really difficult, which is to halt and reverse the decline of many of the species here. And in some cases, I've been incredibly successful, like with the house sparrow that almost got down to a single pair of sparrows here at the farm. They were shot, persecuted, trapped, everything possible to get rid of them in the post-war years, member of the weaver bird family. But I learnt about them, I watched what they needed and kind of learnt what to do to halt and reverse the decline. And now in the farmyard I've over 100 sparrows, and that just shows you what good conservation can achieve when it's applied properly.
And here's one from Dr. Alex, who sends this email in to ask you, Chris, to wish my mum Valerie a very happy birthday. It's her birthday when this podcast is released on the first day of February. Thanks to you, we've been so much more observant on our walks in the East Sussex countryside. For example, we have had the pleasure of sniffing sweet violets. And Valerie recently bought wildflower seed from your website, and she's looking forward to bringing a bit more of High Ash Farm down to Eastbourne. So, yeah, happy birthday, Valerie.
Valerie, a very happy birthday, and thank you for all the emails, not just from Valerie and husband, but from everybody who sends in responses each week. They're all read, they're hugely important to us, and just a huge thank you and a very warm hug from High Ash Farm.
The address, chris@highashfarm.com. And a big thank you as well to those of you who've made contributions to the running costs of this podcast. It's possible to make a one-off or small monthly donation. Just visit the website highashfarm.com/podcast. We're into February now, and the nights are really drawing out, although here we are sitting in the dark.
Yes, we have. Yes, it's another sort of dusk one, but I love this time of day, Matthew. It's usually the end of the working day on the farm, and it's that transition time from all the animals and birds that you see about doing daylight hours. And there's a kind of switch over at the moment to the nocturnal creatures, and that's why I love it. It's like two different worlds, and I'm learning still about both of them.
We'll close with the birds going to bed at High Ash.
This is a very special broadcast. I've just come back to the farm office and Matthew's just left. An email has just popped out the machine. It's from Mark. Hello, he says. My dad, Edward Rackham, will be 80 tomorrow. That's on the 3rd of February. And the email says he's always listened to Chris. He was born nearby in the village of Brook, just a mile or two from where I'm standing, and he's now in a lovely care home. However, and that's why Rat's barking, my demented terrier, he's Rat's #1 fan. So, that qualifies you for a mention, a very special one. So, happy birthday, Edward, for Monday, the 3rd of February. Special regards from Chris Skinner here at High Ash Farm. And from Rat. And I think Rat should have the final word. Where is he? Rat. The demented terrier sends birthday wishes.